Now what the hell do you think you're doing with that tin star, boy?
There are films that entertain, and then there are films that endure. Blazing Saddles, released in 1974, belongs firmly in the second category. Mel Brooks' wildly irreverent Western satire has been quoted at dinner tables, studied in film schools, and debated in cultural essays for more than 5 decades. Most people who love it will tell you they know it inside and out. They remember the campfire scene. They remember Hedley Lamar. They remember the fourth wall, shattering like glass in the final act. But here's the truth that even the most devoted fans quietly miss. The thing that makes Blazing Saddles genuinely great has almost nothing to do with its loudest moments. It lives in the stillness. It breathes in the pauses. And it was delivered almost entirely by one man who nobody originally planned to cast. Gene Wilder did not just show up to play a role in Blazing Saddles. He arrived without warning, without preparation, and without ceremony, and proceeded to give one of the most quietly revolutionary comedic performances in the history of American cinema. And the most remarkable part? He did it on purpose. What Wilder revealed in later years about his approach, his conditions, and his philosophy completely reframes everything you thought you understood about this film. Once you see it his way, to understand what Gene Wilder brought to Blazing Saddles, you first have to understand how close the film came to falling apart before a single usable frame was shot. The role of the Waco Kid had already been cast. Gig Young, a respected Hollywood veteran and Academy Award winner, was set to play the aging, weary gunslinger who befriends Sheriff Bart in a jail cell. On paper, Young had everything the role seemed to require. He was dignified, experienced, and carried the kind of weathered credibility that the character demanded. What nobody fully anticipated was the severity of the personal crisis Young was quietly fighting. On the very first day of principal photography, things went wrong in ways that could not be ignored or managed. Young was visibly unwell. He was trembling, perspiring heavily, and struggling to deliver his lines coherently. Some crew members, in the confusion of a chaotic first day, initially wondered whether they were witnessing some extreme form of character preparation. They were not. Gig Young was in the grip of acute alcohol withdrawal, a medical emergency that is genuinely dangerous and cannot simply be pushed through with willpower. By mid-morning, he had collapsed. Production stopped. The film, which had barely begun, was suddenly in serious jeopardy. Mel Brooks did not hold auditions. He did not call his agent or arrange a formal casting session. He picked up the phone and called Gene Wilder directly, one collaborator reaching out to another in a moment of crisis. The two had previously worked together on The Producers in 1967, and Brooks trusted Wilder with the kind of instinctive confidence that only genuine creative partnerships produce. What happened next says everything about who Gene Wilder was as a person and as a professional. According to Brooks, Wilder did not ask to read the script. He did not negotiate his fee. He did not even ask for a detailed description of the character he would be playing. He simply said yes, and he was on a plane the following day. Think about what that means. Most actors, even those who consider themselves fearless, want preparation time. They want to understand who they are playing, what the character wants, what the emotional arc looks like, how their scenes connect to the larger story. Wilder bypassed all of that. He arrived jet-lagged and underprepared in the conventional sense, and yet, by all accounts, he stepped in front of the camera and inhabited the Waco Kid as though the character had been living inside him for years. That kind of instinctive creative courage is extraordinarily rare. It also tells you something important. Wilder was not the sort of actor who needed a map. He needed a purpose. And once he had one, he got to work. Here is what most retrospectives on Blazing Saddles leave out entirely. Gene Wilder did not simply agree to join the production and then wait for direction. He agreed under a specific condition, one that shaped every single scene he appeared in and fundamentally altered the DNA of the entire film. Wilder told Mel Brooks, before stepping on set, that he would not play the Waco Kid for laughs. Read that again, because it is genuinely extraordinary. A comedic actor, brought in as an emergency replacement on a comedy film, whose co-writer and co-stars were operating at maximum comedic intensity, decided before a single take that his performance would be rooted in restraint, sincerity, and emotional truth. He was not going to mug for the camera. He was not going to wink at the audience. He was not going to reach for the easy laugh that his timing and instincts could have produced on demand. Instead, Wilder told Brooks that he wanted to play the character straight, as a genuinely damaged human being who happened to find himself in absurd circumstances, rather than as a comedic archetype participating in an absurdist sketch. Brooks, to his enormous credit, agreed, and that agreement is arguably the most consequential creative decision made during the entire production of Blazing Saddles. Because what Wilder understood, with a clarity that most performers never reach, was that comedy is not just about what makes people laugh. It is about contrast. It is about the space between the ridiculous and the real. And in a film overflowing with outrageous satire, physical comedy, pointed social critique, and boundary-obliterating absurdism, the most powerful thing Wilder could contribute was none of those things. It was stillness. It was genuine feeling. It was a man who looked like he had actually been broken by the world, sitting quietly in the middle of all that noise. Mel Brooks later spoke openly about this, acknowledging that Wilder's insistence on grounding his performance was not just a stylistic preference, but the backbone of the entire film. Without the Waco Kid as a still, emotionally coherent anchor, Blazing Saddles risked becoming a series of brilliant but disconnected comic set pieces. Wilder gave the film its center of gravity. He gave audiences someone to hold onto while everything around him spun deliriously out of control. When audiences watch Blazing Saddles for the first time, they tend to remember the moments that announce themselves loudly. The campfire scene, the physical gags, the meta-theatrical finale. What they do not immediately register, but what lingers long after the credits roll, is Gene Wilder. His performance works on a delay. It does not demand your attention. It earns it slowly, incrementally, through accumulation of quiet detail. Consider the jail cell scene, which is the Waco Kid's introduction and one of the film's most celebrated sequences. Wilder is lying in a bunk, half drunk, dressed in rumpled clothes, with his hat pulled over his face. He delivers his first lines, without bothering to sit up. There is no performance anxiety in what he does. There is no effort to establish himself as a comedic presence worth watching. He simply exists in the space, with a kind of bone-deep weariness that immediately communicates something real. This is a man who has given up. Not dramatically, not theatrically, but genuinely and completely. The stillness is not laziness. It is a deliberate choice that says more in 30 seconds than a page of expository dialogue could. What Wilder added beneath the surface of that scene was something the script did not explicitly require. Emotional depth rooted in what can only be described as trauma. The Waco Kid's trembling hands, his detached demeanor, his habit of responding to chaos with a kind of exhausted calm. Wilder chose to play these not as comic exaggerations, but as real symptoms. The character's relationship with alcohol was not a punchline in Wilder's interpretation. It was the wreckage of a man who had once been exceptional and had found that being exceptional brought him nothing but loss. When the kid quietly recounts being the fastest gun in the West, there is no pride in Wilder's delivery. There is only regret. It lands like a confession spoken to an empty room. This is the detail that most fans have consistently missed. The Waco Kid is not a comedic sidekick. He is a tragic figure, wearing the loose costume of a comedic sidekick. And the reason the humor works so perfectly in those scenes is precisely because Wilder refuses to tip the audience off. He never tells you it's funny. He trusts you to feel the contrast yourself. That is a masterful and deeply mature approach to comedy, and it is hiding in plain sight across every frame Wilder inhabits. No honest conversation about Blazing Saddles is complete without acknowledging the role that Richard Pryor was supposed to play in it. Pryor was not just a contributor to the screenplay, which he co-wrote with Brooks and several others, bringing the film's razor-sharp racial commentary to its full, uncompromising edge. He was also the performer Mel Brooks had originally envisioned in the role of Sheriff Bart. Brooks saw something in Pryor that he believed the role demanded, a raw, electrocomedic energy, combined with an authenticity of experience that could make the film's social critique feel genuinely dangerous rather than merely clever. Warner Brothers executives blocked the casting. Their concerns centered on Pryor's public profile, his personal struggles, and the perceived risk of anchoring a major studio production around him. The decision was made above the creative team's heads, and it reshaped the film in ways that are still being evaluated 50 years later. Cleavon Little, who ultimately played Sheriff Bart, delivered a performance of considerable charm, wit, and intelligence. He was excellent, but Gene Wilder later reflected on what the film might have been if Pryor had been beside him in that jail cell, and the question is impossible to dismiss. Wilder and Pryor would eventually find each other on screen in Silver Streak and Stir Crazy, and the chemistry they produced in those films was something genuinely special, a kind of spontaneous combustion that neither performer quite replicated with anyone else. Knowing that this partnership could have begun in Blazing Saddles makes the studio's decision feel like one of Hollywood history's most significant missed opportunities. Pryor's influence on the film remained profound regardless. His fingerprints are on every joke that cuts beneath the surface of the satire. The film's refusal to soften its racial commentary, to make the ugliness of prejudice comfortable for white audiences, is Pryor's voice speaking through every scene, even in his physical absence. One of the stranger and more charming aspects of Gene Wilder's performance in Blazing Saddles is how consistently it destroyed the composure of everyone around him, not through broad, obvious comedic moves, but through the precise, unexpected, and perfectly timed delivery of lines that landed in ways nobody quite anticipated until they were already happening. Multiple crew members have spoken over the years about how difficult it was to get clean takes in scenes featuring Wilder, not because of any problem with Wilder himself, but because sound technicians, camera operators, and fellow cast members could not reliably hold themselves together. There is an account, widely repeated among those who worked on the production, of Mel Brooks himself having to physically remove himself from the set during certain scenes because his laughter was bleeding into the audio. The director was being undone by his own cast member. The line that reportedly caused the most consistent disruption was Wilder's quiet, almost apologetic description of the townspeople, simple farmers, people of the land, the common clay of the New West. And then, after the briefest pause, delivered with absolute zero performative indication that anything unusual was coming, morons. The word lands not because of volume or emphasis, but because of the complete absence of both. Wilder says it the way a tired man states an obvious fact. The contrast between the poetic preamble and the flat, frank conclusion is what makes it devastating. And apparently, it destroyed everybody in the vicinity every single time. There are also accounts of scenes that were cut from the final film, longer sequences that explored the Waco Kid's emotional history in greater detail. Wilder reportedly delivered some of his finest dramatic work in material that the film's pace ultimately could not accommodate. Those scenes have never been officially released, and what survives of them exists largely in the memories of crew members who watched them being filmed. The mystery of what was left on the cutting room floor adds another layer to a performance that already rewards deeper attention. One of the least discussed but most consequential aspects of the Blazing Saddles production is what it gave birth to off-screen. Between takes, in the chaotic downtime of a shoot that was simultaneously creative and stressful, Gene Wilder began talking to Mel Brooks about an idea that had been forming in his imagination. It was not a formal pitch. It was not a calculated career move. It was a question posed casually between two people who trusted each other completely. What if the grandson of Dr. Frankenstein was desperately, almost pathetically, determined to have nothing to do with his family's legacy? Brooks was not immediately convinced. He was absorbed in the considerable challenges of the film they were currently making, and a gothic horror parody was not the first thing occupying his attention. But Wilder kept returning to the idea, not aggressively but persistently, with the quiet certainty of someone who knows they are onto something real. He eventually wrote a draft on his own initiative, without any guarantee that it would be produced, because he believed in it enough to do the work for its own sake. When Brooks finally read what Wilder had written, his skepticism evaporated. Young Frankenstein, released in 1974, the same year as Blazing Saddles, became one of the most beloved comedy films ever made. It is a masterpiece of tone, affection, and craft, and it was born during the downtime of another production, conceived in conversations between two collaborators who had built enough trust to share half-formed ideas without fear of judgment. The fact that Wilder's emergency casting in Blazing Saddles led directly to the creation of Young Frankenstein is one of the most beautiful accidents in Hollywood history. It also says something profound about creative partnerships. The best ones generate ideas that exceed the boundaries of any single project. Gene Wilder's contributions to Blazing Saddles extended well beyond what audiences can see on the screen. Behind the scenes, he became one of Mel Brooks' most important allies in the ongoing battle to protect the film's most challenging and essential elements from studio interference. Warner Brothers executives were deeply uncomfortable with much of what Brooks had created. Internal memos called for script revisions, toned-down language, and the removal of scenes that addressed racism with the kind of unflinching directness that made the studio nervous. Wilder did not have the formal authority of a producer or director, but he had credibility, earned through his success on The Producers, and he had Brooks' ear in a way that few people on the production did. In private meetings and production conversations, Wilder consistently encouraged Brooks to hold the line. He understood, with clarity and conviction, that diluting the film's satirical edge would not simply make it less provocative. It would make it dishonest. It would rob the comedy of the very quality that made it meaningful, the willingness to make audiences laugh at things that should also make them uncomfortable. Wilder's position was not that audiences needed to be shocked for the sake of shock. It was that satire only functions when it tells the truth, and the truth about racism in America was not something that could be softened into palatability without becoming something else entirely. He backed Brooks not out of blind loyalty, but out of genuine conviction about what the film was trying to accomplish. That quiet, unwavering support helped preserve one of the most fearless comedies in American film history. In a business that constantly pressures creative people toward the safe and the comfortable, Wilder's stance was itself a form of radicalism. More than 50 years after its release, Blazing Saddles remains a film that people argue about, teach in universities, quote from memory, and return to with fresh eyes. Its selection for preservation in the Library of Congress National Film Registry is a formal acknowledgement of what audiences have always known intuitively. This film matters. It matters not just as entertainment, but as cultural artifact, as social commentary, and as a demonstration of what comedy can accomplish when it is approached with genuine intelligence and courage. Gene Wilder's contribution to that enduring legacy is, paradoxically, most visible in retrospect. When the film was first released, audiences responded most loudly to its loudest elements. Over time, as those elements became familiar through repetition and cultural absorption, what continued to reward attention was Wilder's work. His performance is the part of Blazing Saddles that ages most gracefully, because restraint ages better than extravagance. The jokes that were outrageous in 1974 are familiar now. The emotional truth that Wilder embedded in the Waco Kid is as present and as resonant as it ever was. What Wilder proved with his performance, and with his broader approach to comedy throughout his career, is that the funniest moments are almost never the loudest ones. Comedy is not a contest of volume. It is an act of precision. It is about finding the exact right moment to say exactly the right thing in exactly the right way, and then trusting the audience to meet you there. Wilder trusted his audiences completely. He never condescended to them by over-explaining the joke or telegraphing the punchline. He delivered his lines and let the silence do its work, confident that the people watching were smart enough to feel the gap between what was being said and what was being meant. That confidence, that deep and fundamental respect for the intelligence of the audience, is part of what made Gene Wilder exceptional. It is also what made the Waco Kid the performance that continues to define Blazing Saddles for anyone who looks at the film closely enough to see what is actually there. Not the campfire scene, not the finale, not the most quoted lines or the most celebrated gags. The quiet man in the jail cell bunk, barely bothering to sit up, delivering the truth about the world with a weariness that is somehow both desperately sad and perfectly, devastatingly